In the final, desperate days of World War II, on a remote island in the North Pacific, an act of unexpected humanity unfolded amidst the brutality of war. This is the story of A2, one of the Aleutian Islands, and a moment that transcends the battle lines drawn by nations. In May 1943, American forces landed on A2 to reclaim it from the Japanese, who had occupied it nearly a year earlier. The battle that followed was one of the deadliest in the Pacific campaign, fought in brutal, freezing conditions. The terrain was treacherous, a mix of icy mountains and swampy tundra, all shrouded in a thick, persistent fog. The weather was as much an enemy as the opposing soldiers. After nearly 3 weeks of intense fighting, the American forces cornered the remaining Japanese soldiers. The Japanese commander, Colonel Yasuyo Yamasaki, knew his position was hopeless. Rather than surrender, he organized a final, desperate, banzai-charge suicidal attack intended to inflict as much damage as possible before the inevitable end. On May 29th, the charge began. It was a chaotic and bloody affair, with fighting so close it became hand-to-hand combat. By the end of it, the Japanese garrison was all but annihilated. As the smoke cleared and the eerie silence of the battlefield returned, American soldiers began the grim task of securing the area. They expected to find only the dead and a handful of male prisoners, but what they discovered was something they never anticipated. Huddled together in caves and makeshift shelters were dozens of Japanese civilians, mostly women and children. These were not soldiers. They were nurses, service personnel, and family members of the Japanese forces stationed on the island. Among them were 2 young Japanese nurses, their names lost to the official records of history, but their story preserved through the accounts of the men who found them. They were terrified, exhausted, and suffering from malnutrition and exposure. They had survived the battle, but now they faced a new, silent enemy, the unforgiving Alaskan winter that was fast approaching. The American commanders on the ground faced a difficult decision. They had prisoners, but they were in a remote, hostile environment with limited resources. An order was given to evacuate all prisoners of war to the rear echelons for processing. The able-bodied male prisoners could march, but the women, weakened by weeks of deprivation, were in no condition to make the arduous journey. They were frail, some suffering from frostbite and other ailments. The planned evacuation route was a grueling march of several miles over mountainous terrain, all while a fierce blizzard began to rage. The wind howled, whipping snow and ice into a blinding frenzy. The temperature plummeted, making every breath a painful, icy sting. It was a death sentence for anyone not properly equipped or physically fit enough to endure it. For the 2 weakened nurses, the trek was impossible. The unwritten expectation, the cold logic of war, was that they would be left behind. In such conditions, survival of the fittest was the harsh rule, and a military unit couldn't afford to slow down for prisoners who couldn't keep up. But then, something remarkable happened. The American soldiers of the 7th Infantry Division, men who had just been fighting a brutal life-or-death battle against the Japanese, saw not enemy combatants, but 2 fellow human beings on the brink of death. They saw the nurses, shivering and unable to walk, and refused to leave them to perish in the snow. This wasn't an order from a commanding officer. It was a spontaneous decision born from a shared sense of basic humanity. Without a moment's hesitation, several soldiers stepped forward. They fashioned makeshift stretchers out of their own equipment, trifles, ponchos, and whatever else they could find. Gently, they lifted the 2 Japanese women onto these crude litters. Then, taking turns, the soldiers hoisted the stretchers onto their shoulders and began the long, punishing march through the blizzard. Imagine the scene. A line of weary soldiers, fresh from the horrors of combat, trudging through a blinding snowstorm. They were already carrying their own heavy packs, weapons, and ammunition. Now, they added the weight of 2 human lives to their burden. For miles, they battled the elements, their faces numb from the cold, their muscles screaming in protest. Each step was a struggle against the wind and the deep snow. The visibility was near zero, and the risk of getting lost or succumbing to hypothermia was immense. Yet, they pressed on. They carried the 2 women over treacherous mountain passes and through deep snowdrifts. When one group of soldiers grew too exhausted to continue, another would take their place, never letting the stretchers touch the frozen ground. They shared their own limited rations and water, shielding the women from the worst of the wind with their own bodies. This wasn't a strategic move. It offered no military advantage. In fact, it put the entire unit at greater risk, slowing them down and expending precious energy. It was a purely compassionate act, a moment where the lines of conflict blurred and were replaced by a simple, powerful impulse to save a life. The soldiers didn't see the uniform or the nationality of the people they were carrying. They saw someone's daughter, someone's sister, helpless and in need. After hours that must have felt like an eternity, the exhausted party finally reached the relative safety of the American base camp. The two nurses were immediately taken to a field hospital, where they received medical attention. They had survived thanks entirely to the grit and compassion of the very men they had been told were their enemies. The story of what happened on A2 is not a grand tale of military strategy or a famous battle that changed the course of the war. It's a small, intimate story about a handful of people in an extraordinary situation. It's a testament to the fact that even in the darkest of times, in the midst of unimaginable violence and hatred, the capacity for human kindness can endure. The soldiers of the 7th Infantry Division didn't just win a battle on that island. They won a victory for the human spirit. These men had every reason to be bitter and hardened. They had seen their friends fall in combat. Yet, when faced with a choice between the callous logic of war and the simple morality of saving a life, they chose the latter without question. They carried their former enemies on their backs through a blizzard because it was the right thing to do. This event was quietly documented in the diaries and letters of the soldiers who were there. A footnote in the grand history of World War II.